There's a certain magic in sitting down to watch a film that doesn't just entertain, but dares to reimagine myth, bending the ancient into something startlingly modern. Today, I want to invite you into a world that feels at once familiar and entirely new, a place where folklore doesn't remain trapped in dusty scrolls, but leaps into dazzling, pulsating life on screen. The film we're going to be exploring is Ne Zha 2, 2025. And before we go further, let me extend the warmest welcome to all of you, fellow lovers of stories, seekers of meaning in cinema, and companions in this ongoing dialogue between myth and art. If you're here, it means you're not just looking for another casual take on a blockbuster. You're here because you crave something deeper, because movies to you are more than moving pictures and loud soundtracks. They're mirrors, windows, and sometimes even doorways into how we make sense of our lives. And that's exactly what I want this space to be, a circle of conversation where we lean back together, not just to watch, but to wonder. Now, before we plunge into fire and storm of this story, let me gently ask, if you find joy in journeys like this, if peeling back the layers of film resonates with you, please consider staying with me by subscribing, not out of obligation, but because we're building a community of thinkers, dreamers, and readers of cinematic language, and your presence here adds to that richness. I remember the first time I encountered the myth of Ne Zha, not on a screen, but in fragments of stories told by friends, half-remembered tales that carried both rebellion and tragedy. Even then, the figure of this fiery child god struck me as someone who embodied contradictions. A hero born of defiance, a savior marked by sacrifice. So, stepping into the cinematic retelling wasn't just entertainment. It felt like reconnecting with something archetypal, something that hummed with cultural memory and personal curiosity. What's beautiful about films like this is how they refuse to remain confined to their culture of origin. Yes, the mythology belongs to a particular heritage, but the emotional resonance, the struggle between destiny and freedom, the weight of expectations, the longing to carve one's own path, these are universal notes in the symphony of being human. And as we embark on this review, I hope you'll feel that tug as I did. The reminder that myth is not old, not distant, but alive and burning within us. So, let's begin this exploration together, with open minds and open hearts, ready to see not just a spectacle of animation, but a reflection of ourselves. The story opens not with calm, but with a trembling energy, the kind that suggests the world itself is on the cusp of reshaping. There is fire in the sky, a restless churning of the heavens that feels like both omen and promise. And in that moment, we sense that this tale is not content to merely continue from where it left off, but intends to deepen the very heartbeat of its myth. The first images unfold like a tapestry being unfurled, threads of memory, loss, and rebellion woven together, pulling us back into a world that is at once divine and painfully human. The air is heavy with expectation. Ne Zha, still carrying the weight of his first rebirth, emerges not as a fiery child we once knew, but as someone caught in the tension between past and future. He is alive, yes, but rebirth is never a clean slate. It is a haunting. His return comes with visions, half-formed memories of battles fought, and lives undone, leaving him unsettled in moments that should have been triumphant. Watching him at this stage is like witnessing a comet that has returned from the darkness, its flames bright, but carrying the scars of its own burning. In these early passages of the story, what struck me most was the subtle way the film allows silence to speak. Not every moment is filled with grand declarations. Instead, there are quiet exchanges, glances that carry the weight of unsaid words. Ne Zha's relationship with his parents is particularly poignant here. Their joy at his presence is palpable, yet underneath it lies the unspoken fear. Will the second chance endure, or will fate reclaim what is given? I found myself thinking of how fragile second chances often feel in our own lives, how love can sometimes be tinged with the quiet terror of loss. The heavens, however, are not so easily appeased. The gods, ever wary of mortals who dare to resist their decrees, are portrayed with a cold, almost bureaucratic cruelty. They speak of balance, of order, but behind their rhetoric lies fear. Fear of chaos, fear of mortals rewriting destiny. Ne Zha, by simply existing in defiance of divine decree, becomes a challenge to their authority, a living paradox that must either be subdued or destroyed. It is in this tension that the first half of the story truly blooms, setting up conflicts that are as philosophical as they are physical. As the narrative deepens, we see Ne Zha struggling with his own power. It is no longer the raw, unrestrained energy of a child lashing out, but something heavier, more dangerous, as if his body itself struggles to contain the storm within. The filmmakers capture this with haunting imagery. Moments where his hands tremble as sparks of fire erupt without warning, or where his reflection distorts in pools of water, revealing glimpses of something darker lurking inside. These scenes resonated with me in a personal way. They felt like mirrors to our own battles with inner demons, the aspect of ourselves we fear losing control over. The arrival of new characters adds another layer of intrigue. We are introduced to figures who, on the surface, seem allies, mentors, companions, even kindred spirits, but each carries an agenda, and the film does not allow us to rest in the comfort of certainty. One in particular, a mysterious warrior with ties to the celestial realm, becomes both guide and rival, pushing Ne Zha towards self-discovery while also testing his resolve. Their conversations are rich with double meanings, and I found myself leaning in, almost as if I too were trying to decipher whether this figure wished to nurture Ne Zha's potential or contain it. Midway through the first half, the story crescendos with a breathtaking sequence. Ne Zha, driven by both fear and fury, unleashes his power in a way that shakes the very foundations of the mortal world. Flames spiral upward, mountains crack, rivers boil, and for a moment it feels as though creation itself teeters on collapse. Yet within that chaos, there is a strange, almost tender beauty. The fire does not consume indiscriminately, but seems to pulse with his emotions, wild yet purposeful. Watching it, I couldn't help but think of how human rage, though destructive, often carries within it raw honesty, a cry for recognition. What's remarkable is how the film doesn't frame this as a simple loss of control trope. Instead, it invites us to see Ne Zha's outburst as part of his journey toward understanding who he truly is. The destruction, painful as it is, reveals the contours of his power, hinting that he is not merely a child of fire, but perhaps something far greater, something the heavens themselves fear. This realization, however, is not comforting to him. It isolates him further, driving a wedge between himself and those who love him, creating a rift that aches with both guilt and inevitability. The narrative slows after the storm, allowing us to breathe, but the stillness is tinged with unease. The gods move in shadows, plotting their next step, and whispers of rebellion ripple through the mortal realm. Ordinary people, inspired by Ne Zha's defiance, begin to question whether the heavens' decrees are truly absolute. These glimpses of mortal courage may seem small, yet they carry immense significance, for they show how one figure's struggle can ignite collective resistance. It reminded me of how, in history, myths often give rise not only to heroes but to movements, how stories can become sparks that spread through entire societies. By the time the first half draws toward its close, Ne Zha stands at crossroads. He is no longer simply reacting to fate, but beginning to glimpse the possibility of rewriting it. And yet, the path ahead is clouded with uncertainty, every step shadowed by forces far beyond his control. The heavens tighten their grip, his allies reveal fractures in their loyalty, and his inner turmoil continues to simmer like a volcano not yet ready to erupt. There is a sense of inevitability, but also rebellion, and it is in this delicate balance that the film leaves us breathless, hungry to see what lies beyond. The second half of the story begins not with resolution, but with fracture. The world, already trembling from Ne Zha's eruption of power, finds itself caught between awe and terror. Villages whisper of him as both savior and curse, a child whose very presence bends a natural order. I felt a chill here, watching how the film doesn't grant him the simple comfort of adoration. Instead, it confronts him with the ambiguity of being seen as both divine and dangerous. And isn't that so often the fate of those who challenge the rules? To be loved and feared in the same breath. The gods, in their celestial halls, convene with grim urgency. Their debates are portrayed with an unsettling stillness. Figures draped in radiance, their voices echoing like distant thunder, deliberating over Ne Zha's existence, as though he were a problem to be solved rather than a being with flesh and soul. This part of the film chilled me to my core. The contrast between the gods' cold detachment and Ne Zha's very human turmoil makes the conflict not just a battle of strength, but of philosophies. Are we defined by the destinies assigned to us, or by the choices we insist upon making? It is during this rising tension that Ne Zha encounters his greatest internal test. The mysterious warrior, who earlier guided him with veiled intentions, now reveals sharper edges. What seemed like mentorship curdles into confrontation. Their duel is not just physical, it is almost ritualistic, a clashing of wills, philosophies, and unspoken fears. The animation lingers on every strike, every parry, every hesitation, making the fight feel less like spectacle and more like a dialogue carved into fire and steel. Watching them, I felt as though I were witnessing two mirrors shattering against each other, each reflecting a possible version of destiny. But what gives the second half its aching power isn't only the battles. It's the quiet unraveling of Ne Zha's relationships. His parents, torn between love and fear, begin to question whether they can protect him at all. Friends who once stood by his side falter, their faith shaken by the destruction he unleashed. There are moments here where Ne Zha stands alone, the world around him blurred into silence, and the loneliness feels heavier than any divine punishment. I found myself thinking of those times in life when even love feels like it cannot quite reach us, when the gulf between what we are and what others see in us becomes impossibly wide. The gods, growing restless, descend with force. Their arrival brings one of the most breathtaking sequences of the film. The heavens split open, celestial armies pouring into the mortal world, their radiant forms contrasted with the raw, untamed fury of Ne Zha's fire. The battle that unfolds is not mere chaos. It is choreography, a collision of order and rebellion. Rivers boil, mountains collapse. The sky itself fractures into shards of light and flame. Yet even in this apocalyptic spectacle, the film finds room for intimacy. Between clashes, Ne Zha's eyes often drift toward the people he fights for, their faces lit by both fear and hope, as if silently reminding him why he cannot yield. And then comes a twist, the revelation that Ne Zha's power is not simply his own. It is tied, inexorably, to something older, something buried deep within the cosmos itself. The fire that courses through him is not just rebellion but memory, an echo of a primordial force the gods sought long ago to erase. His existence, then, is not an accident of fate, but the return of something they thought destroyed. This moment hit me like a thunderclap. It reframes the entire struggle, shifting it from the story of a defiant child to the story of a cycle, of history itself demanding to be remembered. What makes this revelation even more compelling is how the film handles Ne Zha's reaction. He does not embrace this discovery with triumph. Instead, he recoils, horrified by the possibility that his life is not his own, that he may simply be another vessel for forces beyond comprehension. This conflict, between the desire for agency and the fear of being a pawn, felt so painfully human to me. How many of us wrestle with the tension between who we want to be and the roles imposed upon us by history, by family, by expectation? The climax builds with unbearable intensity. Ne Zha, battered and scorched, faces the gods in a final confrontation that is less about defeating them than about declaring his right to exist on his own terms. The battle rages with firestorms and celestial storms colliding, but beneath the spectacle lies a quieter, sharper blade of choice. Each blow Ne Zha strikes is not merely against his enemies, but against the very notion that destiny can be dictated. The sound design, the colors, the rhythm of this climax, it all comes together to create not just a visual experience, but an emotional reckoning. And then, in a moment that feels both inevitable and shocking, Ne Zha does not destroy his enemies, but forces them to acknowledge him. His final act is not one of annihilation, but a defiance so pure it bends even the heavens. He becomes not the child god they feared, nor the vessel of an ancient force, but something new, something undefined, uncontainable. Watching this, I felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and melancholy. Exhilaration, because here was a hero carving his own destiny. Melancholy, because freedom always comes at a cost, and we see in his weary, fire-lit eyes that this victory is as much burden as blessing. The resolution of the film carries a haunting quietness. The gods retreat, not defeated, but unsettled, their authority cracked. Mortals, emboldened, begin to see their world differently, whispering of change, of possibilities beyond the decrees of heaven. Ne Zha, standing amidst the ashes of both battle and self-discovery, looks not triumphant but contemplative. The story does not end with certainty, but with openness, an invitation for us to imagine what comes next, both for him and for the world he has irrevocably altered. What stayed with me most after the screen faded to black was not the grandeur of the battles, though they were breathtaking, but the aching humanity of it all, the loneliness of carrying power. the fragility of second chances, the defiance of declaring oneself against forces immeasurably larger. It is these emotional truths that make the second half not just a continuation of the story, but its beating heart. What lingers after the battles and storms of the film are not only the images of shattered skies or rivers boiling with fire, but the people who walk through them, their faces, their choices, their silences. For me, the true brilliance of this story lies in how its characters feel less like distant figures from myth and more like reflections of our own contradictions. Ne Zha, at the center of it all, is not a hero carved from marble. He is fire, yes, but fire that flickers as much as it blazes. What I found most moving about him in this chapter of his saga was not simply the power he wielded, but the vulnerability behind it. He is, in many ways, still a child, haunted by memories of sacrifice, torn between the destiny others assign him and the path he longs to carve for himself. The animation gives us moments where his defiance falters into fear, where his fury dissolves into exhaustion. And those moments are precious, because they remind us that rebellion is never as clean or as fearless as the myth suggests. Watching Ne Zha, I couldn't help but think of those times in life when standing up for ourselves felt both necessary and unbearable, when courage and doubt coexisted in the same trembling breath. What deepens his complexity further is his relationship with power. Fire in this story is not just his weapon, it is his mirror. When he rages, a flame scorch. When he falters, they flicker. When he doubts, they lash out uncontrollably. To me, this was such a poignant metaphor for the parts of ourselves we struggle to control. Our temper, our desires, our ambition. Ne Zha's journey is not simply about defeating external enemies, but about learning to recognize and, if not master, then at least coexist with the storm inside him. That's what makes him feel alive, not his invincibility, but his fragility. Surrounding him, the characters closest to his heart anchor the story in both love and tension. His parents, who once made the most devastating choice of sacrifice, now find themselves in precarious role of guardians to a reborn child who defies both heaven and fate. Their love is steadfast, but what struck me was the fear woven through it. The fear of losing him again, the fear of being powerless to protect him. Their glances at him are filled with tenderness, but also with hesitation, as though every embrace might be the last. It reminded me of how parental love often carries an undercurrent of dread, that quiet knowledge that to love deeply is to risk unbearable loss. And then there's the warrior figure, the one who drifts between ally and adversary. He fascinated me. At first, his guidance feels like mentorship, even kinship, but as his motives sharpen, he becomes something far more complex. He is the embodiment of ambiguity, teacher and challenger, protector and threat. What I loved about his presence was how he forced Ne Zha to see himself more clearly. Every duel, every cryptic word, was less about the warrior himself and more about what Ne Zha discovered in those confrontations. It reminded me of the strange way people enter our lives, sometimes not to stay, but to hold up a mirror we desperately need, however painful the reflection. The gods, in contrast, embody a different kind of character entirely. They are not individuals so much as an institution, cold, radiant, unyielding. Yet within their collective arrogance, the film allows glimpses of something almost pitiable, fear. They speak of order, of balance, but what underpins their actions is terror at losing control, at being rendered obsolete by mortal defiance. They are characters in the sense that they personify authority itself, beautiful, powerful, and brittle. To me, their presence felt like the embodiment of every system we have faced in our lives that insists it knows better than we do who we are allowed to be. The mortals in this world, though often relegated to background, are essential in shaping its emotional texture. Their whispers of admiration, their gasps of fear, their tentative rebellions, they serve as a chorus to Ne Zha's journey. What moved me most was how the film showed them not as faceless masses, but as individuals whose small acts of courage carried immense weight. A villager standing defiantly before a god, a child clutching a crude drawing of Ne Zha, a mother whispering prayers for his survival. These glimpses reminded me that myths are never sustained by God alone, but by the people who choose to believe in them. Even the primordial force revealed within Ne Zha's power felt, strangely, like a character in its own right. It is not given a face nor a name, but its presence is palpable, a haunting, a memory carried in fire. To me, it represented the weight of history, the parts of ourselves we inherit without asking. It is both gift and curse, whispering through Ne Zha's flames, shaping his journey even as he resists it. And isn't that so human? To carry within us legacies we did not choose, to wrestle with the echoes of past lives and past choices that ripple through our own. Together, these characters form a constellation around Ne Zha, each pulling at him in different directions. Love, duty, rebellion, fear. What makes them so unforgettable is not that they are flawless archetypes, but that they're allowed to be contradictory, layered, alive. The parents who love and fear. The warrior who guides and threatens. The gods who shine and tremble. The mortals who despair and resist. In each of them, I found fragments of truths that felt uncomfortably close to home. By the end of the film, what remains is less the memory of battles won or lost, and more the faces of those who stood beside or against him. The characters linger not because they are larger than life, but because they are so achingly human, even when cloaked in fire or divinity. And that, I think, is a quiet triumph of this story. It reminds us that myths endure not because of the gods who command them, but because of the people, flawed and fragile, who live within them. What makes a film memorable isn't always just a story on screen. It's also the strange, unexpected truths hiding behind the curtain, those little fragments of history, chance, and human effort that breathe life into what we see. With this film, the oddities begin long before the first scene was ever animated, stretching back into the cultural heartbeat that first gave birth to Ne Zha as a figure of myth. And perhaps that's what makes every fact about this movie feel a little uncanny, as though the making of it were haunted by the same defiance and unpredictability that define its fiery hero. One of the strangest truths lies in its timing. Sequels are often rushed, but this one arrived after years of silence, the weight of expectation heavy on its shoulders. The first film, after all, had been a phenomenon, setting box office records and sparking global curiosity in Chinese animation. What I find fascinating is how the creators resisted the easy temptation to replicate what worked before. Instead, they built something that feels riskier, darker, and more emotionally demanding. The strangest fact here is that the studio deliberately dismantled its own safety net, throwing themselves into the unknown. It's rare to see filmmakers so willing to unsettle their own success, and I couldn't help but admire that audacity. Another unusual detail is how deeply the production wove itself into ancient mythology. The creators didn't just skim the surface of old texts, they dove headlong into them, pulling threads from obscure corners of Taoist scripture and folk legends that had rarely, if ever, been adapted for the screen. Some of these references are so subtle that unless you grew up immersed in the culture, you might never notice them. For example, certain gestures of the gods, certain ornaments on their robes, carry direct symbolic meaning tied to ancient celestial hierarchies. I found this layering both beautiful and strange. It's like the movie is quietly in conversation with the past, whispering secrets most of us can only half hear. The animation process itself birthed its own peculiarities. The studio reportedly used experimental rendering techniques that allowed fire and smoke to behave less like digital effects and more like organic, living beings. This wasn't just technological wizardry, it was a philosophical choice. The animators wanted the flames around Ne Zha to pulse with emotion, to change in color, rhythm, and density according to his inner state. In some sequences, the fire was almost acted separately, like a character of its own. That detail astonished me, because it means what we're watching isn't just symbolic, but literally constructed as an extension of the hero's soul. It's not often you see an element of nature treated with such intentionality. And then there are the accidents, the delightful, chaotic little stumbles that somehow shape the final film. One of my favorite strange anecdotes is about a key sequence when Ne Zha stands alone on a cliff, fire curling around his body in defiance of the gods. Originally, this scene was storyboarded with far less intensity, but due to a rendering glitch, the flames erupted far larger than planned, curling into massive arcs that engulfed the sky. Instead of discarding it, the directors loved the sheer rawness of the mistake and rewrote the scene around it. What began as an accident became one of the film's most iconic moments. To me, that feels poetically fitting. Even in the making of the film, fire refused to be controlled. Behind-the-scenes dynamics also carried their own strangeness. The voice actors reportedly spent weeks not just recording lines, but improvising emotional exchanges off-script, conversations that were never meant for the film, but helped them inhabit their roles. Some of these raw, unrehearsed emotions found their way into the final product. You can almost feel it in certain whispers, in certain tremors of voice, where it seems less like acting and more like lived experience. For me, that blurred line between performance and reality is where cinema becomes truly uncanny, when you're no longer sure if what you're hearing is fiction or something deeply, vulnerably human. There's also the curious fact of how the film was received during its earliest private screenings. Some viewers reportedly wept not at the battles but at the quiet, domestic moments, Ne Zha sharing a glance with his parents or pausing in silence before unleashing his flames. This surprised even the filmmakers, who had expected audiences to be swept away by spectacle. Instead, it was the stillness, the fragility, that cracked people open. That, to me, is one of the strangest and most beautiful truths about storytelling. No matter how much fire you conjure, sometimes it's the silences that burn the deepest. On a more cultural level, what's odd is how the movie has been embraced not just in China, but by audiences far beyond, many of whom have little background in the midst it adapts. Normally, stories so rooted in specific folklore risk alienating those unfamiliar with it. But here, something unexpected happened. International viewers began connecting their own myths to Ne Zha's journey, comparing Prometheus to Loki, to fallen angels and rebellious demigods. The strangeness of this lies in how a story so particular managed to become so universal, almost as though myth itself refuses to stay bounded by borders. And perhaps the strangest fact of all is this. Despite all the spectacle, despite the technology, despite the painstaking cultural references, what most people walked away with wasn't just a memory of flames or gods, but of a boy caught between destiny and choice. The humanity of it outshone the divinity. That inversion feels unusual, almost subversive, because we expect myth to glorify the divine. Instead, this film turns a spotlight on fragility, on struggle, on the courage of being imperfect. And maybe that's the deepest oddity of all, that a story about gods and destiny becomes, at its heart, a story about us. What makes this story so compelling is not merely what happens, but how what happens resonates beyond the frame. The battles, the silences, the betrayals, the revelations, they are not just narrative beats, but questions carved into the bones of the film. Watching it, I found myself less caught up in asking what next, and more in asking what does this mean? And that, to me, is the mark of a story that transcends spectacle to become something richer, a dialogue with its audience. The first major event that begs for reflection is Ne Zha's explosive eruption of fire midway through the story. On the surface, it is a demonstration of unchecked power, a boy lashing out at forces beyond his control. But beneath the fire, what we are really watching is an allegory for emotion itself. Rage, grief, loneliness, these are not tidy feelings. They arrive in storms, unpredictable and overwhelming. To me, this scene reads like a confession of the human condition. That to feel deeply is to risk breaking the world around us. Yet to suppress feeling entirely is to break ourselves. The brilliance of the film lies in refusing to present Ne Zha's outburst as purely destructive. Instead, it frames the chaos as a step toward self-recognition. In that fire, I saw not just violence, but honesty. Another moment rich with critical significance is the confrontation between Ne Zha and the warrior figure who guides and tests him. Their duel is thrilling, yes, but what struck me was how it functions as more than combat. It is philosophy in motion. Each strike, each pause, is a negotiation of identity. The warrior represents the voice of discipline, of surrendering to the roles assigned by tradition. Ne Zha, in contrast, embodies resistance, the refusal to bend. Their clash, then, is not about victory but about survival of ideals. To me, this is the film's way of dramatizing the tension we all face between compliance and rebellion, between the comfort of belonging and the risk of becoming. Equally potent is the event of divine intervention, when the gods themselves descend upon the mortal realm. This moment could easily have been reduced to mere spectacle, armies of light clashing with firestorms. But it is layered with meaning. The gods' cold insistence on order reveals them less as wise protectors and more as fragile rulers desperate to maintain control. In their very attempt to assert dominance, they expose their weakness. Fear change. This is not just a battle of mortals versus gods. It is a dramatization of authority itself, of how those in power cling to old structures even when they no longer serve. Watching it, I was reminded of countless moments in history where institutions resisted transformation, only to crumble under the weight of their own rigidity. The revelation of Ne Zha's power as a primordial force is perhaps the most thematically loaded event in the film. It reframes everything, suggesting that he is not simply a rebellious child, but a vessel of something eternal, something the heavens themselves sought to erase. But here lies the brilliance. Instead of treating this revelation as liberation, the film complicates it with dread. Ne Zha does not rejoice at the discovery. He recoils, afraid that he may have no agency at all. This twist, to me, elevates the story from mythic adventure to existential inquiry. What does it mean to be free if your very being is bound to forces beyond your choosing? Can we ever escape the weight of inheritance, be it cultural, familial, or cosmic? The climactic confrontation, where Ne Zha defies the gods not by annihilating them, but by forcing them to acknowledge his right to exist, is the film's most radical gesture. So many stories end with a triumph of destruction, but here the victory lies in recognition. Ne Zha does not destroy authority. He destabilizes it, proving that defiance alone can fracture even the most entrenched hierarchies. For me, this was one of the most moving aspects of the story. That resistance does not always require victory, only persistence. It reminded me of how, in our own lives, sometimes the bravest act is simply to insist on our presence, to refuse to disappear, even when systems try to erase us. Even the smaller events carry enormous weight, when viewed critically. The hesitations in Ne Zha's parents' eyes, the whispers of mortals daring to question the heavens, the fleeting silences before fire erupts, all of these moments serve as subtle rebellions against a grandeur divine order. They suggest that change does not come solely from cataclysm, but from countless small acts of doubt, of love, of resistance. I found myself deeply touched by this layering, because it mirrors how revolutions in the real world rarely begin with explosions. They begin with whispers. Taken together, these events do more than tell a story. They create a tapestry of meaning that challenges us to think about power, freedom, and identity. They ask us to consider whether destiny is a prison or a canvas, whether rebellion is a curse or a birthright. And in doing so, they elevate the film from mythic retelling to critical meditation. What lingers for me is how these moments resonate beyond the theater. Ne Zha's outbursts remind me of my own inner storms. His duel with the warrior mirrors the tensions I feel between the safety of conformity and the risk of individuality. The gods' arrogance reflects the systems we grapple with daily, whether cultural, political, or personal, that insist they know better than we do who we are. And his final act of defiance, quiet yet unyielding, feels like an invitation. To stand, to insist, to exist. What always fascinates me about cinema is that what we see on screen is only the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the shimmering images lies an entire world of effort, mistakes, compromises, and flashes of genius, an invisible orchestra of human labor and creativity. With this film, that hidden world is almost as compelling as the myth it tells, because the making of it was itself a story of ambition, risk, and a touch of chaos. The production journey began in the long shadow of its predecessor's success. After the first film shattered records, expectations for a sequel became suffocating. The studio could have played it safe, recycling formulas, offering audiences a comfortable return to familiar beats. Instead, the creators did something daring. They tore apart their own process and rebuilt it from scratch. That decision meant more work, more delays, and more uncertainty, but it also meant authenticity. The strangest and most admirable fact about this production is that the team chose risk over repetition, treating their sequel not as a product, but as a new act of storytelling. Technically, the film is a marvel, and that's not just because of flashy effects. The animators spent years refining their rendering engines to simulate fire and water with emotional depth. It sounds almost absurd. How can an element like water or flame carry emotion? Yet, the team insisted that every frame of fire should respond like a living thing. In practice, this meant building software that allowed fire to flicker with anxiety, surge with fury, or soften with grief. Watching the final result, I couldn't help but marvel at how much in Ne Zha's soul is communicated not through words or even expressions, but through the behavior of his flames. It's one of those details audiences may not consciously notice, but feel all the same. One quirky behind-the-scenes story involves the voice actors. rather than recording isolated lines in sterile booths. The production often had them perform together, improvising exchanges as though they were on stage. This created moments of raw spontaneity, where interruptions, stumbles, or unexpected laughter seeped into the rhythm of their dialogue. In fact, one of the most tender exchanges between Ne Zha and his parents came from such an improvisation, later polished but never scripted. To me, this kind of risk-taking is where animation transcends its mechanical precision and becomes startlingly human. Even stranger are the stories of how accidents shape key moments. At one point, an early test rendered the gods' descent glitched, causing their radiant figures to fracture into kaleidoscopic shards of light. Instead of discarding the error, the team embraced it, weaving that fractured imagery into the final design of the gods' presence. It gives their appearance a sense of otherworldly menace, perfectly fitting given their brittle authority. I love when films let accidents speak, because it reminds us that creativity is not always about control. Sometimes it's about listening to the unexpected. The sheer scale of collaboration is another wonder. This wasn't the work of a small handful of visionaries, but of thousands. Animators, sound engineers, voice coaches, cultural consultants, historians. The team even brought in experts on classical Chinese literature to advise on the authenticity of mythological details, ensuring that the story honored its roots while remaining accessible. That blending of scholarship and spectacle is rare, and is what gives the film its unusual texture. Every gesture, every symbol feels deliberate, grounded in centuries of storytelling. Fun facts ripple through production like sparks. For instance, did you know the animators embedded tiny Easter eggs from Chinese folklore into the background of scenes? A lantern bearing the emblem of an old Taoist charm here, a faint constellation shaped like a dragon there. Most viewers will never notice them, but they act as hidden whispers to those who know the stories. I love that touch. It's like the film is winking at the audience, rewarding those who look closer. The sound design carries its own set of curiosities. Instead of relying entirely on synthesized effects, the team experimented with recording natural elements, crackling wood, gusts of wind, even a hum of old temple bells, and weaving them into the digital mix. In one battle scene, the roar of Ne Zha's fire actually contains layers of human voices, distorted almost beyond recognition. It's eerie but also poetic, as though the fire itself carries the cries of history. Of course, not everything went smoothly. The production faced delays, budget strains, and the constant anxiety of living up to the hype. There were days when the team reportedly worked around the clock, animating thousands of frames only to discard them the next day when they didn't quite capture the right emotional tone. And yet, rather than hide these struggles, many crew members have spoken about them openly, almost with pride, because in their eyes, every discarded frame was part of the journey towards something truer. I find that honesty refreshing. It reminds us that art is not a straight line, but a messy, painful, beautiful process of trial and error. Another delightful insight lies in how the team balanced technology with tradition. While they pushed animation software to new limits, they also returned to hand-drawn sketches, ink brush tests, even traditional Chinese painting styles, studying how water and fire had been depicted in ancient art. Some of these sketches were scanned directly into the production pipeline, leaving fingerprints of the old within the new. That blending of digital and hand-drawn artistry is part why the film feels so alive. It's not just pixels, it's ink and imagination colliding. Perhaps my favorite fun fact is how the creators themselves described the film. They called it not a sequel, but a rebirth, mirroring Ne Zha's own arc. That phrasing struck me, because it reveals how the story of the film and the story of its making overlap. Just as Ne Zha struggles against destiny, the filmmakers struggled against expectation. Just as he refuses to be confined, they refuse to be bound by the first film's success. In a sense, both hero and creators were fighting the same battle. To redefine themselves, to burn brighter without burning out. By the time the credits rolled, I found myself marveling not just at the story I'd witnessed, but at the invisible story behind it. The countless hours of rendering, the accents embraced as art, the scholars and engineers and actors who poured themselves into this tapestry. It all becomes part of the myth. And maybe that's the strangest and most wonderful truth about cinema, that it is always two stories at once. The one we watch and the one that made it possible. One of the most striking things about this film is how the world itself feels alive, as though the settings are not just backdrops but participants in the story. Every mountain, every ripple of water, every stretch of sky carries weight, almost as if the land itself were breathing in rhythm with Ne Zha's journey. That, I think, is what makes the setting here so unforgettable. It isn't passive. It responds, it resists, it reflects. The mortal realm, where much of the story unfolds, is painted with a kind of raw beauty. Villages cling to the edges of mountains, their wooden beams creaking against the weight of wind and time. The animators capture tiny details. Faded paint on doorways, the way dust swirls when a child runs across a courtyard. That make the world feel lived in. But beneath the beauty lies fragility. When Ne Zha's flames ripple through these spaces, the walls don't just burn, they crumble, exposing the vulnerability of human existence in a cosmos ruled by divine forces. For me, this juxtaposition was powerful. The small, tender texture of mortal life against the overwhelming sweep of celestial conflict. The natural world is rendered with similar attention. Rivers gleam with an almost otherworldly luminescence. Mountains loom like ancient guardians. Skies shift with moods that mirror the story's tension. I was especially struck by how the weather itself seems to align with Ne Zha's inner state. When he doubts, clouds hang heavy. When he rages, lightning splits the horizon. When he grieves, rain falls not gently but in torrents, as though the heavens themselves were weeping with him. This intertwining of environment and emotion is not accidental. It's a cinematic language that turns the setting into a mirror of the soul. But the most breathtaking setting, of course, is the celestial realm. Unlike the earthy textures of the mortal world, the heavens are depicted as radiant yet sterile, a place of impossible symmetry and blinding light. At first glance, it is awe-inspiring, gleaming towers, endless skies, figures draped in luminous robes. And yet, the longer we linger there, the more unsettling it becomes. The symmetry feels oppressive, the light harsh, the silence suffocating. It's a brilliant inversion. The heavens, which should symbolize perfection, instead radiate unease. To me, this was one of the film's most potent symbolic gestures. That power, when divorced from humanity, becomes not divine but hollow. The battles between realms give the animators license to unleash visual poetry. When the gods descend, the sky fractures, spilling shards of golden light that cut across the mortal landscape. When Ne Zha unleashes his fire, it doesn't simply burn. It bends the air, warps the earth, reshapes the very geometry of space. I found myself watching not just the action, but the world's reaction to it. How rivers boiled, how forests twisted, how mountains groaned under the strain. The environment becomes a witness, almost a casualty, reminding us that cosmic struggles are never contained to heroes and villains. They ripple outward, touching everything. One subtle but fascinating element lies in the film's use of color. The mortal world is saturated with earthy tones, reds, browns, greens, giving it warmth and immediacy. The celestial realm, in contrast, glows with stark whites and silvers, colors that dazzle but also distance. And Ne Zha himself burns with hues that shift across the spectrum, from crimson rage to soft amber vulnerability to a searing white that suggests transcendence. Watching these palettes collide in climactic moments was like watching ideologies clash in pigment form. Color itself becomes part of the storytelling, guiding us toward emotional truths without a single word spoken. The soundscape, too, is inseparable from the setting. The creak of temple bells, the rustle of wind through bamboo, the distant hum of celestial choirs, all these sounds give texture to the world. I was fascinated by how the film often blends natural and unnatural sounds. For instance, the crackling of Ne Zha's fire is not just fire. It carries faint undertones of human voices, almost like ancestral whispers. The celestial halls, meanwhile, echo with tones that are beautiful yet dissonant, reminding us that perfection is not the same as harmony. This layering makes the world not just visible, but audible in ways that deepen its presence. Even the smallest settings carry meaning. A quiet courtyard becomes a stage for parental hesitation. A lonely cliff becomes a site of revelation. A shattered bridge becomes a symbol of broken trust. What I love about the film's approach is that no place is wasted. Every location, however brief, is charged with symbolism, as if the land itself remembers. This is something that distinguishes the film from many blockbusters. Instead of treating settings as disposable stages for action, it treats them as repositories of memory. For me, the most haunting setting was not the celestial palaces or the fiery battlegrounds, but the moments of stillness, the empty fields after battle, the quiet rooms when Ne Zha sat alone, the silence of spaces that had borne witness to chaos. These places spoke more loudly than explosions. They reminded me that setting is not just about spectacle but about aftermath, about the weight that lingers in the air when the fire has gone out. In the end, the settings of the film are as much characters as the people who inhabit them. The mortal world carries fragility and resilience. The heavens radiate sterile oppression. The natural world mirrors inner turmoil, and the colors, sounds, and silences weave together into a language that speaks as eloquently as dialogue. Watching it, I felt as though I were not just observing landscapes, but moving through living, breathing beings that shape the story as much as any god or hero. The beauty of any film lies not just in what we see, but in the countless unseen hands that guided it into being. For me, the behind-the-scenes story of this movie feels almost like another myth layered atop the first, one of human persistence, fragile collaboration, and unexpected flashes of joy amidst exhaustion. Animation often gives the illusion of perfection. Every frame seems intentional, every gesture precise. But behind that illusion lies chaos. Late nights, failed experiments, laughter in cramped recording rooms, frustrations that spill into silence, and breakthroughs that arrive at the most unlikely moments. The team behind this film embraced all of that mess, and in doing so, created something that feels alive. One of the most fascinating behind-the-scenes dynamics was the bond between the voice actors. Unlike many animated productions, where actors record separately, here they were often brought together into the same room, allowed to improvise, interrupt, even argue. There are stories of actors breaking into laughter mid-line, of one stumbling over a phrase only to find that the imperfection made the scene more poignant. These small accidents weren't discarded. They were folded into the film, giving dialogue a rhythm that feels less scripted and more like conversation. Watching the movie, I could almost hear the echoes of that studio space, the warmth of real people breathing life into myth. The directors themselves had a unique relationship with the team, both demanding and deeply personal. It's said that during particularly difficult sequences, the director would walk among the animators' desks, offering not corrections, but stories. He would retell ancient myths, paint verbal pictures of fire curling around a child's grief, describe how gods might fear the defiance of a mortal. Instead of technical notes, he offered images, leaving animators to interpret them in their own way. I find that extraordinary. It transforms filmmaking from a rigid process into something closer to oral storytelling, where each contributor becomes part of the myth-making. There were struggles, too, and they were not small. Rendering the fire alone became an ordeal that stretched the team's resources to the brink. Computers crashed, sequences had to be restarted from scratch, and entire weeks of work sometimes dissolved in errors. One animator reportedly described the process as trying to teach fire to feel. That phrase stuck with me because it encapsulates both the madness and the poetry of the task. They weren't just drawing flames. They were sculpting emotions out of them. What's heartening is how the crew leaned on one another through these difficulties. There are accounts of team members bringing food to night shifts, of entire groups collapsing into laughter after hours of failed renders, of someone strumming a guitar in the corner while others hunched over glowing screens. These human details remind me that art is never born from machines alone. It is born from communities, from tired hands and shared jokes and the stubborn refusal to quit. One of the most surprising insights was how much cultural consultation shaped the production. Historians and folklorists were invited to the studio to give lectures, answer questions, even challenge the creative team's assumptions. At times, this created tension. The scholars urging fidelity to ancient texts, the artists pushing for reinterpretation. But rather than seeing this as conflict, the team embraced it as dialogue. That tension between tradition and innovation became, in a way, the heartbeat of the film itself. There were lighter moments, too, strange little stories that feel like folklore in their own right. During one recording session, the actor voicing Ne Zha reportedly lost his voice mid-scream. Instead of halting production, another actor stepped in and let out a scream so raw and unplanned that it was kept in the final cut. In another instance, an animator accidentally left a tiny doodle of a rabbit in the corner of a battle sequence. It went unnoticed for months before someone spotted it, and though it was erased, the rabbit became an inside joke among the team, appearing on sticky notes, mugs, even t-shirts. These small, playful touches make me smile, because they remind us that behind mythic grandeur lies ordinary human mischief. The greatest challenge, however, may have been psychological: the weight of expectation. After the first film's triumph, the pressure to deliver something equally groundbreaking was immense. Crew members spoke of nights lying awake, terrified that the sequel would disappoint. And yet, that fear also fueled them. It bound the team together in a shared determination not to let their creation become hollow. That invisible battle between anxiety and faith, between exhaustion and hope, seeps into the film itself. You can feel in the trembling silences, in the way fire refuses to be tamed, in the defiance that burns in every frame. By the time the film was complete, the crew had not only built a movie but lived through their own kind of epic. They had wrestled with gods of technology, faced storms of doubt, found unexpected joy in mistakes, and held each other up through the long, exhausting nights. When I think of the final product now, I don't just see Ne Zha's defiance. I see the echo of hundreds of human hearts that beat behind the scenes, each one leaving its trace on the story. And maybe that is the most beautiful behind-the-scenes insight of all, that what we watch on screen is never just myth. It is human persistence, human laughter, human exhaustion, and human wonder, crystallized into light and sound. It is not only Ne Zha who was reborn in fire. It was the filmmakers themselves, burning and remaking themselves in the act of creation. Every great myth pulses with themes that outlive the story itself. Beneath the flames and battles of this film, I found myself tracing currents of meaning that run deeper than spectacle, connecting the narrative to questions of identity, destiny, power, and love. What makes the themes here so compelling is how they are woven seamlessly into character and setting, never preached but felt, like the hum of something eternal beneath the noise of fire. At the heart of it all is the theme of destiny versus choice. Ne Zha is born into a role he never asked for, chained to expectations from both mortals and gods. He is at once feared as a curse and needed as a savior, and this duality becomes his prison. Watching him wrestle with this inheritance, I thought of how many of us feel bound by circumstances we did not choose. Our families, our cultures, our histories. The film doesn't offer an easy answer. Instead, it acknowledges the weight of destiny while insisting on the power of choice. Ne Zha's greatest act is not defeating enemies, but daring to say, "I will not be defined by what you decide." To me, that's where the film transcends its mythic frame and speaks directly to our own lives. Another theme that burns through the story is rebirth. Ne Zha's very existence is a rebirth, a second chance carved from sacrifice. But the film complicates this idea. Rebirth is not a clean slate, but a return haunted by memory. He carries the echoes of past sacrifice, the scars of battles fought before. This resonates with how we, too, experience renewal. We do not begin again without baggage. We begin again carrying fragments of what came before. The symbolism of fire underscores this beautifully. Fire destroys, yes, but also purifies, reshapes, transforms. Ne Zha's flames are not just weapons. They are metaphors for the painful, necessary process of becoming new. The theme of authority versus defiance runs like a thread through every frame. The gods, with their cold radiance and rigid laws, embody a system that insists on obedience. Ne Zha, with his untamed fire, embodies a refusal to submit. But the film resists reducing this to a simple good versus evil dichotomy. Authority is shown not as inherently malicious, but as brittle, fearful of change. Defiance, meanwhile, is not glorified without cost. It isolates, it wounds, it terrifies even those who love you. This nuance made me reflect on how rebellion in our own world often looks. Not clean, not easy, but necessary. Born not from hatred, but from the insistence that freedom is worth the price. Family and love form a quieter but equally powerful theme. Ne Zha's parents embody the paradox of parental love. Their willingness to sacrifice everything for him, and their terror at losing him again. Their glances are filled with both tenderness and fear, capturing the truth that to love deeply is to risk unbearable loss. I was especially moved by how the film doesn't idealize this love. It shows the hesitation, the fragility, the unspoken doubts. That honesty makes it feel universal. And Ne Zha's journey, though framed in fire and destiny, is ultimately about connection, whether he can hold on to love even as he defies everything else. The theme of fear oneself is another haunting undercurrent. Ne Zha is not only fighting gods, he is fighting the storm inside him. His flames lash out unpredictably, threatening to consume what he loves. This fear mirrors something deeply human, the terror of our own capacity for destruction. How often do we fear our anger, our ambition, our desires, those parts of us that feel uncontrollable? The film's genius is in refusing to present mastery as the solution. Ne Zha does not conquer his fire. He learns to coexist with it. That, to me, is profound symbolism, the idea that wholeness is not about control, but about acceptance. Even the settings carry symbolic weight. The heavens, radiant but sterile, symbolize authority divorced from compassion. The mortal world, fragile but warm, symbolizes humanity's resilience. Fire itself is the most potent symbol, destruction, yes, but also transformation. Every flicker of flame is layered with meaning. Rage, grief, renewal, love. In fact, the flames often shift color depending on Ne Zha's emotional state, turning symbolism into literal cinematic language. One of the subtler but fascinating themes is memory and history. The revelation that Ne Zha's power is tied to a primordial force reframes his struggle as part of a cycle larger than himself. It suggests that history, no matter how much authorities try to erase it, finds ways of returning. I found this deeply moving because it mirrors how suppressed truths in our own societies often resurface, demanding acknowledgement. The symbolism here is clear. The fire within Ne Zha is not just his. It is a memory of those who came before, carried forward in defiance of erasure. Even the gods' fear is symbolic. Their obsession with order represents the human tendency to cling to structures, even when those structures no longer serve us. Their fear in Ne Zha is really fear of change. In this way, they become less divine figures and more symbols of every institution that resists transformation, be it political, cultural, or personal. Ne Zha's defiance, then, is not just rebellion against gods, but against stagnation itself. Perhaps the most poignant symbolism lies in the final confrontation. Ne Zha does not destroy the gods, but forces them to recognize them. This moment symbolizes the idea that victory is not always about conquest, but about existence. To stand, to be seen, to refuse erasure, this is its own kind of triumph. That ending, for me, is one of the most radical symbolic gestures I've seen in recent cinema. In the end, the themes and symbols of this film form a tapestry that resonates far beyond mythology. Destiny and choice, rebirth and memory, authority and defiance, fear and acceptance, love and loss. These are not just ideas in a story. They're the fabric of our lives. And what makes the film unforgettable is how it weaves them not as lectures, but as lived experience, etched into fire, silence, and fragile human connection. What always amazes me about cinema is how much of its impact lies not in what is told, but in how it is told. A story like this could have been rendered in countless ways. Too grand, too simple, too safe. But what makes this film linger is its artistry, the careful stitching of sound, image, rhythm, and craft into something alive. And perhaps most intriguing of all is how the world responded to it. The numbers and reviews that tell their own story of reception. One of the first things that struck me is the visual technique. Fire, which might have easily become a mere special effect, was treated as a living presence. Animators built custom algorithms to let flames bend, curl, and twist like emotion itself. Every flicker is expressive. Sharp when Ne Zha rages, tremulous when he doubts, expansive when he accepts himself. This is not just clever animation. It is visual storytelling at its purest. The fire speaks where words cannot, carrying symbolism in every ember. The cinematography of animation is another marvel. The filmmakers use angles and framing with the precision of live-action directors. When Ne Zha feels small against destiny, the frame widens, swallowing him in vast landscapes. When he erupts in defiance, the camera tilts upward, making him tower like a force of nature. The rhythm of these shifts mirrors his emotional arc, guiding us to feel the world as he does. One of my favorite sequences uses a long, unbroken shot to follow Ne Zha through chaos. Flames trailing him like a second soul, it creates a sense of breathless immersion, as though we are running beside him. Editing plays its own quiet role in shaping mood. The film is unafraid of silence. Long pauses stretch between bursts of action, forcing us to sit in unease, in grief, in contemplation. These pauses are as important as the battles. They remind us that mythology is not just noise, but resonance. When action does arrive, the editing accelerates, cutting sharply, rhythmically, almost like percussion. The contrast between silence and explosion heightens the impact, leaving us trembling in the shift. The sound design deserves particular attention. Every sound feels intentional, layered with hidden meaning. Flames do not crackle generically. They carry faint undertones of whispers, as though ancestors breathe within them. Celestial voices echo with dissonant harmonies, beautiful yet unsettling, suggesting that order can be sterile, even oppressive. Mortal spaces, in contrast, hum with warm, textured noises. Children's laughter, market chatter, the rustle of wind through bamboo. Listening closely, one can hear how the film uses sound to divide worlds. Divine and mortal, oppressive and human. It's an invisible line, but we feel instinctively. The score amplifies this division. Traditional Chinese instruments blend with modern orchestration, creating a soundscape that bridges past and present. Drums thunder like heartbeats during battles, while flutes carry fragile, intimate moments. Sometimes the music disappears altogether, leaving only silence, an artistic choice that allows emotion to breathe. One haunting scene, where Ne Zha confronts a revelation of his power, unfolds with no music at all, just the sound of his breath and the quiet hiss of fire. That restraint makes the moment sear deeper than any swelling orchestra could. What fascinates me, too, is how the film uses symbolic cinematographic motifs. Repeated images, a lone figure against the horizon, fire reflected in water, fractured skies become visual echoes, reminding us that the story is not linear but cyclical. These motifs whisper that Ne Zha's journey is not just his own, but part of a larger pattern, a cycle of defiance and rebirth stretching back through history. Now, turning from craft to reception, the story of its box office journey is almost mythic in itself. The film opened to enormous anticipation, fueled by the legacy of its predecessor. Within days, theaters were filled not just with children but with adults, scholars, and international audiences eager to witness the continuation of a cultural phenomenon. Records tumbled in its opening weekend, with ticket sales surpassing expectations in both domestic and overseas markets. What's remarkable is that its financial triumph was not built solely on spectacle. Reviews poured in praising its depth, its willingness to tackle existential themes alongside dazzling action. Audiences spoke of leaving theaters not just entertained but shaken, reflective, even teary. This resonance helped the film maintain momentum long after premiere, sustaining box office strength through word of mouth rather than hype alone. Interestingly, international reception revealed something curious. Viewers unfamiliar with Chinese mythology still connected to its themes, comparing Ne Zha to Prometheus, to rebellious demigods, even to tragic heroes from Western canon. This cross-cultural recognition turned the film into more than a local success. It became a global conversation. For me, that is as significant as any number. Proof that myth, when told with sincerity, transcends borders. The financial side of the story is impressive, but what moves me more are the audience testimonies. Parents spoke of seeing their children gaze wide-eyed, inspired by Ne Zha's defiance. Adults admitted they saw themselves in his fear of expectation, his struggle to reconcile destiny with selfhood. Some even described the film as cathartic, a way of processing their own doubts and desires. These responses reveal what no chart or record can, that the film's true box office lies in hearts stirred, in minds awakened. In the end, the filmmaking techniques and production success form a kind of dialogue. The artistry of flame, sound, silent, and image created an experience so powerful that audiences carried it beyond the theater, into their own lives. The box office numbers prove its reach, but the emotional echoes prove its impact. And perhaps it is the ultimate triumph, not just to earn, but to endure. What always moves me about films, especially animated ones, is how the voices and emotions we hear are the product of unseen humans, breathing life into myths. Watching Ne Zha 2, 2025, I was struck not only by the fiery spectacle, but by the way its cast seemed to pour themselves into every whisper, every scream, every trembling moment of silence. Behind the blazing child god, there are actors, artists, and creators whose own humanity seeps into the myth, making it resonate with ours. The actor who voices Ne Zha carried perhaps the heaviest burden. In interviews, he spoke of how daunting it felt to return to a character so beloved, a figure who had already left such a mark on audiences. It was like coming back to a conversation you thought had ended, he admitted, and realizing there was more to say, but in a different tone. He described how he intentionally altered his voice across the film, lighter, almost fragile in moments of doubt, sharp and edged when defiant, deep and weary during revelations. Listening carefully, you can feel that layering, as though Ne Zha's journey is charted not just in flames, but in the shifting timbre of his voice. His parents, voice actors, also revealed tender insights. The actress who voiced Ne Zha's mother confessed that she sometimes cried in the booth, not because the script demanded it, but because imagining that level of fear and love for a child overwhelmed her. "I wasn't performing," she said. "I was remembering." That word, remembering, stuck with me. It suggests that art at its best is not invention but memory. Actors call upon fragments of their own hearts to give breath to characters. The father's voice actor, meanwhile, spoke of the challenge of balancing sternness with vulnerability. He wanted the character to feel protective without ever slipping into caricature. His voice carries that weight. You can hear the hesitation, the catch in his throat, the way love and fear collide. The warrior figure, both ally and rival, was voiced by an actor known for playing stoic roles. But in an interview, he laughed about how he found the role liberating. "People expect me to sound unshakable," he said, "but here I gotta lay strength with doubt, loyalty with menace." It was like dancing in contradictions. That, I think, is why the character works so well, because the actor embraced the contradictions instead of smoothing them away. The directors, when asked about the cast, emphasized improvisation. They encouraged actors not just to read lines, but to play, to interrupt each other, stumble, even invent. One fascinating tidbit: the trembling, "I don't want this destiny" line from Ne Zha wasn't in the script. It slipped out during a heated recording session, raw and unscripted, and the team immediately wove it into the film. For me, that kind of moment is where cinema becomes alive, when an actor's own truth bleeds into myth. But perhaps the most moving insights come not from the cast, but from the audiences who sat in the dark and emerged with fire in their hearts. Reviews pour in from every corner, scholars praising its philosophical weight, parents grateful for a story that resonated with both children and adults, teenagers confessing that they saw their own struggles mirrored in Ne Zha's defiance. One viewer wrote, "I came for animation. I left with the courage to tell my parents I want a different life." That single line captures the power of art. It does not stay on the screen. It spills into lives, altering them in quiet, profound ways. International audiences added their own perspectives. Many admitted they had never heard of Ne Zha before, yet they connected with his archetype, the rebel, the misunderstood child, the figure who defies gods. Western reviewers compared him to Greek titans, to tragic Shakespearean heroes, even to superheroes battling fate. What's strange and beautiful is that none of these comparisons feel forced. The film invites them because its themes are universal. That universality is reflected in reviews that speak not of a Chinese story, but of our story, proof that myth transcends culture when told with sincerity. Some audience reactions were unexpectedly emotional. In theaters, people reportedly wept not during the climaxes, but during quiet moments, when Ne Zha hesitated before his parents, when he sat alone with fire flickering weakly around him. Critics noted that this was the film's greatest triumph, making silence as powerful as spectacle. Children, on the other hand, were captivated by the sheer energy of the flames, the dazzling battles, the sheer audacity of a boy standing against gods. And yet, even they seemed to grasp the deeper lesson, often repeating Ne Zha's lines about choice and freedom in their own words afterward. The cast themselves were humbled by the reception. In post-release interviews, several actors admitted they had feared audiences would find the sequel too heavy, too philosophical. Instead, viewers embraced its depth, proving that animation is not confined to children's entertainment, but can carry the weight of myth and philosophy. The actor voicing Ne Zha said with a smile, "I thought people wanted another hero. Instead, they wanted the truth." That, I think, sums up the film's achievement. What I love most about exploring these interviews and reviews is how they reveal a circle. The cast poured themselves into the story, the audience received it and carried it into their lives, and in turn, the cast and crew felt renewed by that reception. It's a dialogue, not a monologue. And in that dialogue, Ne Zha 2, 2025, becomes more than a film. It becomes an experience shared between makers and viewers, a fire passed from one hand to another. There's something bittersweet about reaching the end of a story, especially one that burns so brightly. Watching this film felt, for me, like sitting beside a fire on a cold night. Sometimes too hot, sometimes frightening in its unpredictability, but always alive, always reminding me that warmth and danger are often intertwined. As I let the final images linger in my mind, I realize that the story in Ne Zha is not just about a rebellious child god. It is about us, about the fires we carry, the choices we face, the fears we wrestle, and the small acts of defiance that shape our lives. Looking back, the plot itself unfolds like a storm. The fragile beginnings of Ne Zha's second life, the surging tides of conflict with gods and warriors, the revelation of his primordial power, and the final act of defiance where he forces even the heavens to acknowledge him. Each stage is not just narrative but metaphor, asking us to see our own reflections in myth. To me, the brilliance lies not in the twist or the spectacle, but in the way the film makes us feel that destiny is not some distant concept, but something we wrestle with daily. Every time we choose, every time we resist, every time we accept or reject the roles others assign us. The characters linger. 2. Ne Zha, fragile and fiery, embodies the contradictions of being human. Strong and afraid, rebellious and uncertain, destructive and tender. His parents remind us of the terror and beauty of love, of how caring for someone means risking unbearable loss. The gods, brittle in their authority, show us the cracks in all systems that cling too tightly to power. And the mortals, the villagers, the children, the quiet figures in the background, remind us that change is never carried by one alone, but by the murmurs and whispers of many. These figures feel less like characters of myth and more like mirrors, each holding up fragments of our own struggles. Themes and symbols weave through the film like invisible threads. Destiny versus choice, fire is both destruction and renewal, authority trembling before defiance, love fragile yet enduring. These are not just cinematic devices, but truths that echo in our own lives. The symbolism of fire is especially haunting. Watching it shift colors and moods across the film, I felt it reflected the storms we all carry. Our anger, our grief, our love, our longing to be free. Fire destroys, but it also illuminates. It reminds us that to live fully is to risk burning. And then there's the artistry, the filmmaking itself. The flames crafted as though alive, the soundscape layered with whispers and bells, the cinematography that widens and narrows with Ne Zha's spirit, the editing that lingers on silence before bursting into chaos. These techniques are not ornament, they are meaning. They shape how we feel the story, how we breathe with it, how we carry it after the credits roll. To me, this is where the film achieves its most radical act. It treats every detail, every flicker, as part of the language of myth. Behind the screen, the story production is its own epic. Animators wrestling with stubborn flames that refuse to behave, voice actors improvising lines that bled raw emotion into myth, directors whispering ancient stories to guide exhausted teams through sleepless nights. There's something profoundly moving about knowing that the film itself was born of struggle, laughter, accidents, and persistence. In a way, the crew became like Ne Zha themselves, defying expectations, pushing against constraints, burning through doubt to carve something new. And then came the reception, the circle completed. Audiences wept not just at spectacle, but at silences. Children repeated Ne Zha's lines about choice, while adults saw in him the weight of their own burdens. Critics compared him to Prometheus, to fallen angels, to Shakespearean rebels, proof that myth transcends borders when told with sincerity. Reviews glowed not because the film dazzled, but because it resonated. And for me, that is the greatest triumph of all, not that the film broke records, though it did, but that it broke open hearts. As I step back from it now, I realize that the story Ne Zha 2, 2025, is not confined to the screen. It has become part of us, part of the way we think about destiny, rebellion, and love. That is a strange alchemy of cinema. It takes myths carved in fire and ink and turns them into living memories we carry forward. The film ends, but the questions it raises do not. They follow us into our own choices, our own rebellions, our own quiet acts of defiance. And so, as I bring this exploration to a close, I want to thank you for walking with me through myth and flame, for listening not just with your ears, but with your imagination. If this journey has resonated with you, if you found yourself reflecting on your own fire, your own choices, your own myths, I invite you to stay connected. Subscribe, not as an obligation, but as part of a growing circle of people who love stories, who believe that cinema is not just entertainment, but conversation, reflection, even transformation. Because at the end of the day, that's what we're building here together. A place where films are not consumed and discarded, but lived with, argued with, cherished. A place where Ne Zha's fire burns not only on the screen but in us, reminding us that destiny is never final, that defiance is never wasted, that even the smallest flame can light the darkness. So let's carry that flame forward, together,